Hello, my name's Michelle Herczog. I'm the History Social Science Consultant here at the Los Angeles County Office of Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special webcast about the College, Career, and Civic Life C3 Framework for Social Studies State Standards and the implications for civic learning. A while ago, we produced a webcast that presented an overview of the C3 framework. It featured Susan Griffin, Executive Director of the National Council for the Social Studies, and the chief architects of the document, Kathy Swan, S.G. Grant, and John Lee. But in this broadcast, we want to take a deeper dive to focus on one of the content areas found in Dimension 2, civics. The C3 framework repurposes the teaching of the social studies to prepare students for college, career, and civic life. So this content area, civics, plays a particularly important role in the education of all our students. We're going to begin with a very brief overview of the document, and then we'll tell you a story, a true story, about one of the most important free speech Supreme Court decisions ever made. It's the story of Tinker versus Des Moines. And with us on the broadcast today is the one and only Mary Beth Tinker. Thank you, Mary Beth, for joining us today.
Thank you, Michelle, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you here, too. Following Mary Beth, we will introduce you to Peter Levine, the Lincoln Filene Professor of Citizenship and Public Affairs and Director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, CIRCLE, at Tufts University. He's considered to be one of the leading authorities on civic learning, the primary author of The Guardian of Democracy, the Civic Mission of Schools, and a member of the writing team for the civics portion of the C3 framework. Peter, we're delighted you can join us online.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, you'll meet Marshall Croddy, the president of Constitutional Rights Foundation, lead for the California campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools, a member of the advisory panel of the California Task Force for K-12 Civic Learning, and a member of the task force who contributed greatly to the development of the C3 framework. Marshall, we're so glad you're here too.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm very happy to be here and to join the discussion.
Before we get started, let's remind everyone of the basic principles and design of the C3 framework. So as you can see from this first slide, you can download a copy of that, just to remind you, at National Council for the Social Studies, and the website there is below, socialstudies.org/C3, and that's free and downloadable. Just to remind folks, the rationale for developing the C3 framework. As you know, we had Common Core state standards for English language arts and mathematics, and Next Generation Science standards was coming out as well. And the social studies community wanted to create something that would address some of the marginalization of our subject area that's been occurring over some time. We also think it's important to motivate young people to learn and understand the power of social studies education. And we're concerned about the future of our democracy. If we want it to be strengthened and endure, we need to educate our young people about what it is and how it operates and how they're a vital part of it, to be involved very much so in it. The original purpose, of course, was to use as a resource for states, to use it as they updated their own state standards. It's a framework, it's not specific standards, but it's hopefully going to help them in redesigning and updating that. But that being said, it's still a very powerful resource at the local level. So whether your states are adopting standards or not, we think it's a powerful tool for increasing the rigor and relevance of social studies education. Before the work got started, all of the subject areas within the social studies came together and reached consensus on the term, first of all, social studies, and a definition for what it should mean. And you could see that here. The social studies is an interdisciplinary exploration of the social sciences and humanities, including civics, history, economics, and geography, in order to develop responsible and informed and engaged citizens and to foster civic, global, historical, geographic, and economic literacy. So you can tell from this that this isn't just about memorizing dates and facts. It's about acquiring knowledge to use in the real world in relevant, powerful ways that will strengthen our democracy as well. The objectives, as we mentioned, is to enhance the rigor of the social studies discipline. This is not a soft subject. There's some incredible rigor and content involved and critical thinking skills, problem solving, and participatory skills to really actualize a lot of that learning, because that's how you become engaged and responsible citizen, using the knowledge you acquire in real-world situations. We also see it as a wonderful bridge to the Common Core state standards. Social studies teachers everywhere are being asked to help implement those Common Core standards, or even in states where they haven't adopted them, to kind of adopt new attention to literacy. We think the C3 framework provides a real strong bridge and linkages to help people acquire, meet that task. This was a big, hard work, 3-year effort led by states through the Social Studies, Assessment, Curriculum, and Instructional Collaborative at the Council of Chief State School Officers. 23 states had sent their lead social studies experts. LA County Office of Education was represented, in the University of Delaware. But that, of course, was just a small group as part of the total picture. 15 professional organizations forming the task force, 17 writers, 50 teachers, editors, designers, all kinds of different groups, and over 3,000 folks responded in the feedback reviews. So you could see it was a very large, comprehensive, diverse group of individuals and groups that were involved. The task force members played a powerful role. These are our national organizations that lead an incredible amount of high-quality professional development resources, working on the ground with teachers across the nation. Probably have more face time with teachers than any other network I would imagine across the country. So needless to say, experts in their areas, in their content, their pedagogy, and practice. So they were a vital part of this work and critically important. So it was absolutely necessary they be part of it. So what is the ultimate goal? For students to study civics, economics, geography, and history, to become active and engaged citizens in the 21st century. Not memorizers of knowledge, but to use it in real-world, powerful ways. It's based on some principles, as we mentioned, to prepare young people for college, career, and civic life. The inquiry is at the heart of the social studies. Questioning, asking questions, digging into content, exploring different pieces of evidence to answer those questions. In fact, a lot of people feel that good social studies often prompts more questions than answers, and that keeps people enlivened and enriched in the thinking of our discipline. It's formed by the core disciplines of civics, economics, geography, and history, but yet we also have attention to psychology, sociology, anthropology, and the other humanities as well. They're not left out of this, of course. The principles of the C3 framework are composed of deep and enduring understandings, concepts, and skills. They emphasize skills and practices as preparation for democratic decision-making. And of course, we believe that we do share in the responsibility for literacy instruction in K-12 education. We need students to be able to read and comprehend complex texts in order to understand the complex concepts of the social studies. So the two really do work very much hand in hand. And so in a nutshell, here you see is the foundations, the inquiry arc, disciplinary literacy, and all about moving towards strengthening civic life. There's 4 dimensions to the inquiry arc, and when you dig into the document, you can see this in more detail. Dimension 1 is about starting with a question, a compelling question. What would cause a young person to get excited about learning history or civics or geography or economics? So why not start with something such as, was the American Revolution really revolutionary? Was the Civil Rights Movement a success? Those are the kinds of framing of questions that get kids excited about further study. And we want them to dig into the content, dig into those tools and concepts to find evidence and information to answer those questions. We want them then to look at multiple perspectives. This is something not new to the social studies. We want them to evaluate those sources, use that evidence to come up with a conclusion themselves, and ultimately taking some informed action based on the knowledge that they've acquired. So for many, some of these aspects of the inquiry arc represent some instructional shifts for social studies. For many, putting inquiry at the center is kind of a stretch. You know, so oftentimes we're used to reading through the chapter and answering the questions at the end, but starting with questions up front, that's a shift for some. But we think it's an exciting way to go. We talk about disciplinary integrity and interdisciplinary connections. So this is not a soft subject study anymore. And this is when you do meld the four areas and all of the humanities, you have to be conscious that you're not upsetting the integrity of those individual disciplines. There is a certain historical, civic, geographic, economic habits of mind and specific content. You want to maintain that integrity, and the C3 does an excellent job of doing that. Taking informed action and applying knowledge of what you learned in clear ways is a shift for many. We've often said study of history is fascinating, but the lessons of the past will always remain in the past if we don't help students understand and find ways to apply it in their world today and to new situations as they come up. The inquiry arc for many can be a shift as well, as a frame for teaching and learning. Questions, sparking more questions, creates some uneasiness sometimes in the classroom. But that's what we want in good social studies, kids to think and explore and be lifetime learners, and inquiry and questioning can do that in powerful ways. The ultimate goal is civic engagement. And how do we define that? Active and responsible citizens are able to identify and analyze public problems. They're able to deliberate with other people about how to define and address the issues. They know how to take constructive action together as a group and reflect on those actions, create and sustain groups, and influence institutions both large and small. They vote, serve on juries when called, follow the news and current events, and participate in voluntary groups and efforts. Teaching students to be able to act in these ways as citizens significantly enhances preparation also for college and career. And so just to remind you, you can find the document and all kinds of resources, teaching sample lessons. We're looking at all kinds of video assets. The site is going to be built bigger and bigger over time, so continue to check back at socialstudies.org/C3 as you move forward to implement the framework in your classroom. So now it's time to share a story, a powerful story that every American should know about. Mary Beth Tinker was a student at Harding Junior High School in Des Moines, Iowa during the Vietnam War. Her family believed it was important to be honest about expressing their views about various issues, and they had some definite views on the Vietnam War. Mary Beth is here with us today to tell us this real-life story. Thank you so much for being here today, Mary Beth.
Thank you, Michelle. It's so good to be here today and part of this project.
Well, we're excited. Can you explain for us a little bit what you and your brother did so long ago and how it led to that historic Supreme Court decision?
Well, it was really the historical times, because in the late 1950s, then the anti-nuclear war movement built up. The peace sign was created by a man named Gerald Holcomb in England in 1958, and it really meant nuclear disarmament. And then by the early 1960s, the civil rights movement was also really building up. And so on TV, we saw children in Birmingham, Alabama, 2,000 children that year on the Birmingham Children's March. And that was a great inspiration for us kids as well, to see these kids that had so much courage. And they were attacked by dogs and water hoses, and they kept going. They kept singing their songs like "This Little Light of Mine." And to us kids, that was a great inspiration. And my parents, were very concerned about this as well. So by the next summer, which was Mississippi Freedom Summer, we're just coming up on the 50th anniversary of that, 1,000 college students went from all over the country to Mississippi to help register African-American voters that year. They were called by the civil rights workers like John Lewis and Robert Moses. And as soon as they got there, 3 of them were killed by the Ku Klux Klan. Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. And a word went out all over the country, please people come to Mississippi this year so that these kids don't get killed. And my parents went there. And they told us about the events of that summer and the courage of the people there who were facing the shootings and the attacks, the beatings by the Ku Klux Klan. And so those were the times that I lived in. And interestingly, in 1964, when those 3 civil rights workers were killed, some students in Philadelphia, Mississippi, wore buttons to school to protest, and the buttons said, "One man, one vote, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee." They were suspended from school, and it started working its way through the courts, and in the end, that case would be what the Supreme Court relied on later for the ruling in our case.
Very interesting.
It was called Burnside.
Yeah. Talk about some more about what you and your brother decided to do.
So by 1965, I had all of these examples of young people and adults also standing up and speaking up for a better way and caring about their community and showing their love through their civic involvement, which is what we're talking about today. And so by 1965 on TV, we saw now more and more scenes of the war, the burning huts, the children running from their huts, the body bags on the ground with the soldiers. There had been about 1,000 soldiers, U.S. soldiers, killed by then. And every night on the news, we would hear the report by Walter Cronkite saying the body count today was 10 soldiers killed in Vietnam. And of course, this affected us kids very much.
Oh, I remember it too. You remember it, Marshall? Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just like today. The news, kids know what's going on. They hear about these things. They're affected emotionally. They naturally then want to do something. And that's how we felt. We wanted to express ourselves about that. And so my older brother John and some of his friends, by then we were Quakers. And my father worked for the Quakers. And so that was all about peace. So some of the kids in our group and some of the kids at the Unitarian Church and Chris Eckhart, some of the other students at the high school, they decided to just wear simple black armbands to school to mourn the dead in Vietnam.
Was that an easy decision for you to go to school to wear that?
No, I was such an ordinary child and I was a very shy girl. And that's part of my message to kids today, is that you can be a shy person, you can be, you know, you don't have to be Rosa Parks. You can be you. You can be you and make a difference.
Right.
And I was very shy and I thought, well, that's what other people do. That's not really what I do. That's what those kids in Birmingham do. That's what my parents do. That's what other people, but I'm not like that. I have to go roller skating on the weekend and I have to study for my math test because I was a very good student and math was my favorite subject. Social studies too, but especially math. And so I was not really geared towards, making a stand and sticking out in a crowd. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to be popular too, like a lot of kids.
So what happened when you went to school wearing this?
Well, a couple of days before we were going to wear our armbands, the principals learned about our plan because one of the boys at the high school wrote an article for the school paper about it. His name was
Did you know they were writing the article?
Ross Peterson wrote the article. I didn't really know much about it because they were at a different high school. I was in junior high and they were the older kids at the high school. So we weren't really friends, but we knew about each other. And I mean, this was all part of a large community, a peace community. And so there were young people in it. And there were also adults that were around that were supportive of the peace actions that were going on there in Des Moines, Iowa at that time. But when the older kids, decided that they would wear black armbands to school, they asked me about it. And so I thought about it and I decided I would try to join in also. Even my little sister, Hope, and my little brother, Paul, he was in 2nd grade and she was in 5th grade. They decided to join in on it too.
Oh, they wore the armbands too?
Yes. So
that's funny.
They took civic action as well to their elementary school.
It's really in the blood in that family. So what happened when you went to school?
Well, I just had an armband like this, and I was really scared and nervous. And I picked up my friend Connie, as I always did on my way, and then I went to school, and kids asked me why was I wearing the armband, and so I started explaining little by little. I was very shy, and I gradually gained confidence. And then at lunch, some of the boys were making fun of me, but I ignored them like us girls always did. And so when I got to my math class, my math teacher, Mr. Moberly, was waiting at the door of the math class with a pink slip. And so he looked so scary, and I was really nervous, and I went and
the actual
took
pink
the
slip?
slip. It's one from that year. I'm not sure it's the actual one because the date is a little later. Maybe I started a trend then, but of getting in trouble. But anyway, so I went to Mr. Moberly and I took the pink slip from his hand. I was very nervous, and I went down to the office, and Miss Tanner, the girl's advisor, told me to take off the armband. So in a great stand of courage and conviction, I said, "Okay, Mrs. Tanner," and I took off the armband, which is also part of my message to young people, that you can stand up and take civic action even in the face of fear, and even if you're nervous, and even if you're scared. Just use the little bit of courage you may have, because you could be amazed at what a difference it might make.
So you took the armband off, but the story doesn't end.
The story didn't end because then I was suspended anyway. And so I went home, and my father hadn't, really thought we should wear the armbands necessarily because it was against the rules. Of course, that's the most difficult part of the story to explain to students, because through history, there have been people that break the rules and even that do things that are illegal. And that's called civil disobedience. And Martin Luther King wouldn't have written his letter from Birmingham jail without it. And so that's a very, difficult thing to explain to students, but I do try to explain that to students, because when I went home, my dad, who thought we shouldn't have really done it because it was against the rules, we convinced him by saying, "But Dad, look what you've done in your own life to speak up and stand up for what you believe is right." And so it would have been, the next day a boy named Chris Eckhart the same day I was suspended, a boy named Chris Eckhart was suspended, and several others that had been involved with writing the article, Ross Peterson, Bruce Clark, Chris Singer. The next day my brother John was suspended. Interestingly, my little brother and sister at the elementary school, they weren't suspended. Their teacher said to the other kids at the playground, "Now kids, we have rights in our country, and Hope and Paul are expressing themselves, and so we have a right to our different opinions in our country."
Really?
They were not suspended.
Interesting. So you were suspended for how long?
We were suspended until we would go back to school without the armbands, and so it
There's
was
another
Christmas.
decision to make too.
Yes, and it was Christmas time, which was why we took our action. As I said, it was about love. It was about peace. It was about making a better world where people get along and don't have war. And Senator Robert Kennedy called for a truce that year, 1965, as the war was escalating. He called for a truce, and so us kids, which kids I think are logical, we decided that that's a good idea, a truce at Christmas time. And so that's why we wore our armbands at Christmas time, and we were suspended until we would go back to school without the armbands. And you can see the creativity of young people too. When we went back to school, we decided we would just wear all black clothes
Oh.
the rest of the year.
Really?
Because we said, well, they can't tell us to take our clothes off. So we wore our black clothes, and we still made our message, and that's a message to kids too. You can find ways to express yourselves with
What
your
was the
creativity.
reaction from that?
Well, people kept talking about the war, and I think that people understood why we wanted to express ourselves, and I myself, and I think the other students really didn't get a lot of harassment after that. Chris Eckhart, I think, got the most harassment at Roosevelt High School, where the gym teacher and some of the students, threatened him, and the assistant principal threatened that, maybe he would want to get a busted nose, or he was, that kind of talk. But later on, it all worked out because.
So how did it get from there to the Supreme Court?
It would have been the end of the whole thing, except that, and we thought it was the end of the whole thing. We had no idea that this was going to be a big deal. And that's another message to students, that your small actions are really what will usually make history, and that's what does make history. But we had no idea that this was going to be a big a big deal. But except when we got suspended, there was a group called the American Civil Liberties Union, and of course they're still very active, and they've been to the Supreme Court more than any organization in the United States through history because of their stand for the Bill of Rights.
So they
And
saw
they
what had
came
happened.
and offered my parents a lawyer, but first they suggested, and of course we agreed, let's go to the school board and try to negotiate. That's another message with students of how to be civically involved. You can try to negotiate, solutions to problems. And again, it's about love and understanding and treating each other with respect. And really, that's what the First Amendment is about, I think. So we tried to go to the school board and we tried to negotiate, and 2 members of the school board did vote in favor of us students.
Really?
But in the end, we were not allowed to wear the armbands. And so the American Civil Liberties Union took the case, and it went to court, and then we lost at the district level, and we lost at the appeals level. A couple of weeks before we lost, the Burnside students in Mississippi won at the appeals level.
Interesting.
And so then you had the perfect setup for an appeal to the Supreme Court. And that's what happened. It was appealed to the Supreme Court, and we were so happy that they agreed to hear the case, because they don't take very many cases, as you know. And then in 1969, when I was in 11th grade, living my ordinary life, studying for my classes, we had just moved to a new city, St. Louis, and I was very much involved in trying to adjust to a new school that year. The Supreme Court ruled by 7-2 that neither students or teachers shed their constitutional right to freedom of expression at the schoolhouse gate, and that students are persons under our Constitution. And I love telling students that good news, that they're persons under our Constitution. And since then, of course, there has been a cutback in the rights of teachers as well as students, because they usually do go together. There were 3 cases after ours, all ACLU cases, by the way, 3 Supreme Court cases that cut back on the rights of students. But now we're in a period where, like the time when I grew up, we're living in a time much like the time that I grew up, where there are so many issues. We have the inequality, the racial discrimination, our climate crisis, we have the war and the war economy. We even have our own marriage equality issue. Back then it was interracial couples, but now we have our gay marriage equality issues. And so now young people are standing up and speaking up, and so many adults are encouraging them, like you today. And I'm so glad that that's going on. And I meet teachers all over the country that are doing the same thing, and students who are speaking up.
Well, I think one of the remarkable things about your story, and there's so many, is that, these are big issues, and I agree, I think young people are interested in them, but they feel they're too big, that I'm just one little person and I can't make a difference. And you kind of went into it thinking that too, we're just students, but yet it did make a big difference. And it turned into this landmark decision. So that's inspiring, that you just don't know. You just don't know. And you should have the wherewithal to at least try and take informed action.
In the Supreme Court ruling in the Tinker case, the Supreme Court ruled that students do have rights in the schools, but there are limits, as there are to all rights. And I teach students this also, of course, that the court said that students cannot substantially disrupt school, and that students cannot impinge on the rights of others. And of course, that's a very gray area that's open to interpretation, and that's why all of us need to be involved and civically engaged, because these things are decided by human beings. And so there are limits on those rights as well. But sometimes people break the rules peacefully and with a willingness to accept the consequences.
Yeah.
And that's a great tradition in our country that we have. It's a tradition of dissent, of civil disobedience, and sometimes even that degree of expression is required and is respected also in our society, in our democratic society.
There's a lot of interesting aspects to this story, and it's reminding me, Marshall, when we were developing the C3 and the conversation around taking action, or taking informed action. And I'm really glad we settled on that informed action because it speaks to so much about what you have to do before jumping into things.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think Mary Beth's story talks about being informed about the issues, being informed about what the options were, and even the consequences, understanding that sometimes there are consequences for taking a principled stand on something. But I also want to emphasize that there are so many different ways that young people can get involved to solve and to address community problems and issues that don't necessarily involve civil disobedience or breaking rules, and they can still be just as effective. There are lots of techniques, just sometimes, as you pointed out earlier, negotiation, or taking on an issue where every citizen has a right to have a point of view about and can bring pressure on decision-making bodies and can advocate with others to make their voice more powerful. So I think the message is it has to be informed, and there are many, many, many ways that you can use informed action to make a difference. Yeah. And they don't always have to end up in the Supreme Court. In fact, they don't necessarily always work. But the more that you develop those skills and can contribute that way, the better I think our democratic republic is going to be.
Yeah, and I think you make a very good point. I'm reminded too, you take kids through these kinds of processes and we have to remind them that you may not win. And it's very easy for kids to get discouraged, say, well, I'm never doing that again. Or when you vote for a candidate who doesn't win, well, I'm never going to vote again. You don't want to go down that path. That democracy is messy. Right. But I also like in the Civic Mission of Schools talks about one of the proven practices of involvement in school governance. So when young people are involved in just making decisions for the school, that's a great way of taking informed action. Right. Such a treat to hear it firsthand from someone who is actually there and involved, and what a great experience that you could share with us.
Well, thank you so much for everything that you're doing to increase student involvement.
Well, it's a team effort. We're all working real hard at it because it's important. And I think it's exciting, too, that here this is something that happened so many years ago, and you went on to become a registered nurse, and now you're leading the Tinker Tour. So we're going to come back a little later and talk to you some more about your work today and spreading the word. Let's turn our attention now to Peter Levine, who's joining our broadcast from Tufts University in Massachusetts. Peter, you're considered by many across America to be the preeminent scholar of civic learning, and you've contributed so much to the field by conducting research, resources, establishing online venues for students and adults to dialogue about democratic practices and civic learning. For all these reasons and so many more, you were chosen to be one of the writers of the civics portion of the C3 Framework for Social Studies State Standards, along with Dr. Mira Levinson from Harvard University and Cynthia Tyson from Ohio State University. Peter, can you share your thoughts? Why is the Mary Beth Tinker story and so many others like it so important for students to learn?
Michelle, your intro is way too nice, but I'm glad to be with you. The Mary Beth's story is a fantastic illustration of what we're trying to teach through the framework. First of all, it's a really important story because kids were involved. Kids were the plaintiffs in the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And of course, the issues in the case had to do with kids' rights to free expression in schools. And I think it's very important for kids to understand that the Constitution is still alive, that it's still being debated, that the issues are still contested, and that they both affect kids and that kids can make a difference in changing them.
Thank you, Peter. And as we mentioned, you were deeply involved in the development of the C3 framework. Can you tell us more specifically, how does the C3 framework help teachers teach these important civic stories to prepare students for effective citizenship?
Well, the C3 standards are fairly streamlined. They're not super long. There's actually not that many standards. And they aim for big, important, perennial, controversial, but central principles and ideas. And a lot of those ideas, or several of those ideas, come up in Mary Beth's story. Freedom of expression, the role of the Supreme Court and judicial review, and a bunch of other ideas. And because the C3 standards are going for big, important ideas and are not larded with thousands and thousands of extraneous or miscellaneous topics, a teacher using the C3 framework could really take the time to investigate Mary Beth's story, in its context with her narrative, and also with what happened afterwards, because the story didn't end with Tinker v. Des Moines. There have been other Supreme Court decisions since, and there have been other legislative actions since. For example, your state legislature in California has actually been pretty positive about this stuff, and it's important for kids to understand that it's not just the court that makes decisions about how we govern, it's also a lot of other institutions. The other thing about the C3 is it ends with taking informed action as a key standard, and of course, Mary Beth took informed action. So it's an example, and it's something that kids can think about as they take action.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter, for your insights and helping us understand the real purpose for the vision of the C3, which is to create active and engaged citizens. Other major contributors to the C3 were the members of the task force, and there were many of them, as you can see in our slide here. These organizations provide tremendous on-the-ground experience with classroom teachers, programs, resources, professional development. They've been doing a lot of C3-like work before the C3 even came about, and so it was really important that we have them involved in the development of the C3 framework. Marshall Croddy's here with us today, representing the many civic organizations of the task force, to provide us an inside glimpse of the work of that task force. Marshall, tell us a little bit about the important role of the task force and its involvement in the C3.
Well, Michelle, I think the role of the task force was vital. It had representatives from the 4 key disciplines: civics, history, economics, and geography. Very able, very capable people, all of them very experienced in education. And we saw our role as working very closely with the representatives from the states and the writers, as Peter was one, to make sure that this framework was, as Peter said, efficient, but also very, very, very deep, and would lead to the kinds of outcomes that we think are necessary to educate a young person for civic life in the United States. So we were very, very particular about how we worked. It was a very intense process. We had input from a lot of subject matter experts. We constantly collaborated with our other partners. We made numerous changes, and some of it was pretty intense. I mean, when we started, there was a perception that perhaps the 4 disciplines couldn't work together, couldn't produce a document that would have, where everyone would have to give a little bit and take a little bit. But I think in general, we all came to the conclusion that it was important for social studies and it was important for this country that we were able to produce this. So the work continued through draft after draft, working with the writers. And I think, I personally believe that it is an excellent document. I think that it is the key component is, and we're very proud of from the civics perspective, is Dimension 4. We think that puts an excellent capstone and an excellent goal for the whole framework. And so with all of those parameters, I would say that we think that ultimately this could have a great influence on social studies education.
I think you're right. We had the best of the best there contributing to the work. And so thank you. Well, let's go a little deeper, though, and talk specifically about civic learning. As a member of the task force, Marshall, what do you see as the power of the framework to be able to teach those important civic lessons, such as Tinker versus Des Moines?
Well, in your overview, we talk about the inquiry arc. I think it's a civic learning arc. We start off with the first dimension and we look at asking effective questions, inquiry. What are the questions that citizens need to know about? Then we move to the 4 disciplines, and it's pretty key that for most issues, or for many issues, you have to have a pretty sound grounding in those disciplines. I was thinking this morning about the Crimea incursion by Russia. You have to know something about the history of how Russia has behaved towards that area of the world. You have to look at the geography of why Crimea is so important to the Russians because of the necessary fair weather port. You've got to understand something about the Cold War and how the dynamics between the United States and Europe and Russia took place. You really have to understand something about American foreign policy establishment and how we make foreign policy. Yeah. So all of those things have to come together before you even understand what the issues are. And then as you go through, once you come to those and you have the question and you have background about it, there's also the question of how do you draw a conclusion? What should happen? And I think that that's why Dimension 3 is so important. Evidence-based decision-making, conclusions based on evidence. Yeah. And then finally, once you have that, you have to be able to communicate those things as either an advocate or as an explainer to others about your position, and it's necessary for you to take action. It might be voting, it might be, making presentations on the issue, or even talking to friends and collaborators. But the point is, you should be able to take action based on what you've learned. So in a sense, the 4 dimensions take you through that process and give a student and a young learner a deep background for participating in civic life.
Yeah, I like how you called it a civic learning arc. That's a great term for that. And now that the C3 is out, tell us a little more about what some of the organizations are doing to support implementation. Constitutional Rights Foundation, Center for Civic Education, Street Law, American Bar Association. You're already doing a lot of C3-like work in the past, but how are these groups helping us now with
Well, we're working very closely with the National Council of Social Studies, and we're trying to make sure that there's an effective implementation. We understand, the basic purpose of the task force is to influence the development of state standards, but we also believe that it has other potentialities, including, how individual districts or local educational agencies conduct social studies education. And we think it can even inform the practice of teachers. Individual teachers can take a look at that document and think, this is really one of the primary goals, is to prepare people for civic life. And if I do prepare my students, they're going to be much more effective, much more engaged citizens as they go along. So we're the 5 organizations are looking at our own existing work and trying to make it correspond more effectively to the C3. We're incorporating C3 into our teacher professional development programs. We're even meeting continually as a task force along with NCSS representatives to get the word out about C3. So I don't think C3 is over. The implementation phase has just begun.
Yeah. I think you're right, and we just came from the California Council for Social Studies annual conference, and Susan Griffin was here with us from NCSS, and we were amazed at how many people had come up to us saying, I'm using the C3 with the standards we already have.
Right.
So here was even something that was originally intended to help states update. We're finding it's really been extending its reach, even in states where standards are not being updated.
That's right. So
that's been wonderful to see people kind of actualize that and use it. So great.
And
thank you.
One other thing I'd like to say, and it kind of reflects back to what Peter said, and that is, you have to take time to do this right. We can cover lots and lots of standards, but we really need to take time to make sure that students get an education more deeply than just broadly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's return again to our discussion of Dimension 4. Peter and Marshall, you both brought it up. I think we agree it's probably the most powerful piece of the C3 because it really changes the purpose and dynamic for social studies to prepare them to become students to become engaged citizens. So let's dig a little more. Peter and Marshall, your thoughts. How does Dimension 4, in your mind, support civic learning in powerful ways?
Well, the purpose of education for democracy is to educate young people to take informed action. Citizens are supposed to act. That's what makes a democracy work. And so we've always, I think, been trying to prepare young people to be active and informed citizens. And in fact, data shows that a lot of teachers already do experience an action in their social studies classrooms. It's nothing completely new. And most state standards have something to say about action somewhere in the standards today. But the C3 definitely makes a bigger, more central purpose out of of action, gives them a greater weight, makes them the culmination of what we're trying to educate, the kind of test of whether we've really educated in a useful way. Kids should be able to take informed action. When people are cautious or concerned about the taking informed action standard, I think it's often because they imagine very narrow types of, or very particular types of action. So they think either of something very political, like, for example, wearing armbands in school and going to the Supreme Court, Mary Beth, or service learning. And I'm actually in favor of both those two things in the right place, and we've done a lot of work with service learning over the years. But there are only two examples, and there's lots of other ways that you can take informed action, including by raising awareness about an issue in the classroom, by doing research projects together, by creating media, by creating online news. So there's lots of things you can do, and different forms of action will be appropriate for different schools, different kids, different grade levels. So there's sort of not one kind of action, but all kids should take informed action.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's true. Not every action is going to result in a Supreme Court decision, but we want kids to make smart decisions too. Schools get very nervous when kids react to issues in inappropriate ways, or they're upset about a particular issue and their response is, well, let's just walk out of school or cause some disruption. We can't entirely blame students on this. They don't know. They're not informed. They don't know how to address and approach these issues in democratic, responsible ways, and that's our role of schools. So I think that's an important piece. Marshall?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that the important thing about Dimension 4 is that that kind of engagement really works best by doing, not just learning about it. But I think it has to be fairly rigorous, and I think it has to be very directed. So what we advocate is what I call civic-based service learning, which is basically where you look at an issue or a problem, you examine its causes, its effects, you go and you interact with policymakers. I mean, virtually every policy and issue has a public policy involved with it. It could be at the local level, it could be at the school level, it could be at the state level, it could be at the national level, and frankly, even the international level. But there's policy in effect. You may want to change that policy, or you may want to embrace that policy. But we need people to start interacting about policy, and policymakers are those who are participating. And then the step beyond that is the action itself. You're educated about the problem, you've looked at it from a variety of perspectives. Where do you go from there? Well, you take your own action. You formulate it, it's intelligent. You have to form constituencies sometime. You have to go out and make sure that you're getting the message across. You have to refine your actions as you go. So there's a check-in where you're constantly refining. And then finally, I think you need to document and show what it is and communicate both the changes you want to make and how you are taking action. So it becomes part of an educational process, which ultimately gives students practice in what we want them to be doing as adults in their communities and our state and our nation.
And I think it helps us redefine what we mean by civic learning. In some places it's, well, if you learn about the three branches, you're done. That's your civic learning. But the action piece is to act on what you've learned in a fair, responsible way that's legal and embraces the democratic process.
Legal, our democracy requires it. Our democratic republic requires citizens to do that. So we shouldn't discourage it. What we should do is encourage it and make sure that it's done in the right way.
And Marshall, you talked about the collaborative nature of that. You can't take action alone to be effective. You need collaborators, you need supporters, and collaboration is a very important aspect of the C3 and effectiveness for taking action. It requires people to work collaboratively with a broad audience and organizations and stakeholders. Collaboration is key, and it was interesting that the strength of the C3 framework came out of a collaborative process that brought together a number of individuals and organizations with very different perspectives, but still common goals and a very strong commitment to a common end. Peter, talk with us a little bit about the collaborative nature of the work from the writer's perspective. How did that work?
Well, so we had to come up with a common draft, and there were 12 people, and they had different perspectives, especially different disciplinary perspectives, because there were historians, economists, geographers, and sort of civics people who are partly political scientists. So there was some push and pull and some disagreement, but I actually think that there's also a tremendous amount of overlapping consensus about what kids should learn, especially when you go to the deep underlying principles. If you have to negotiate about what exact topics, which exact 18th century figures you're going to spend time on, then people will disagree. But if you're talking about the core principles, which are exactly what is in the C3 standards, in fact, there's wide ideological and disciplinary consensus. I don't think there were any severe rifts in the group.
Marshall, your work with the task force.
Well, it was very collaborative on a discipline by discipline basis. The civics task force tended to work by itself for creation of the dimension for Dimension 2. But before that and after that, we've come together and I think worked collaboratively on a lot of things. And I think the writers are to be congratulated because they're the ones that had to pull all this disparate stuff together. And I know there was some push and pull in there, but I think overall people pretty much agreed that the goal and the nature of the final document was more important than, small battles. And so I'm very proud of how it all came together. I think it's there to be congratulated. I think everyone who was involved did their part, and I'm very hopeful that it's going to be a very significant piece of work.
Yeah. Well, they say democracy is messy.
It was that.
This was a little messy too, but the product I think is just phenomenal, and we are all so excited to get it in teachers' hands and see what they do with it. It's quite magical, and to see 1,000 flowers bloom and people take it on and do it in different ways, I think this is the exciting part now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter, for taking time out of your schedule for joining our conversation today. It's a pleasure to work with you. I hope we can continue to collaborate.
Thanks very much for having me.
So let's return to Mary Beth Tinker. Mary Beth, tell us a little bit about the Tinker Tour, why you started it, what it is, and what you're accomplishing.
This year I've taken a leave from the hospital where I worked as a nurse, and I'm traveling the country with a Tinker Tour, a special project of the Student Press Law Center. I'm traveling with an attorney, Mike Heastan, to speak to students all over the country about how they can be civically involved and how they can use their rights to speak up and change something in their lives, in their schools, in their communities as well. And so we have the endorsement of so many national organizations like the National Council of Social Studies and the Campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools, and almost 30 civil rights, civics organizations, and journalism organizations, the ACLU, the NAACP, the Society for Professional Journalists, and we're traveling all over, and people can find out more about it at tinkertourusa.org. We have our armbands that we're signing for kids and teachers. The museum is one of our endorsers, and that's where the real armband is, along with a display about students' rights. And so they're one of our supporters, and they've helped us by printing our armbands. And then we have our coloring books, true stories of kids now speaking up and using their First Amendment rights to make a difference in their own lives today. And we're having a lot of fun. We just kicked off our West Coast Tinker Tour a couple days ago at the Road to Success Academy here in LA. And so I'm very happy to be embarking on our Western Tinker Tour this spring.
Very powerful and wonderful that you're doing it, putting the energy in it. Yeah.
And that's my message to kids too. When you speak up and stand up, you meet so many interesting people, life becomes meaningful, and it's even fun.
Yeah. Well, that's great, and we so appreciate you being here and sharing it with us. Just terrific.
So
Thank
great
you.
To be here. Thank you.
So I want to take this opportunity to thank all our guests today for sharing their insights about the C3 framework and how it can be used for preparing students, not just for college and career, but to become engaged and active citizens. Mary Beth, thank you again for joining us today. And Marshall Croddy, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
It was great having Peter with us too. Thank you all for joining us today. And of course, I want to thank our wonderful tech crew here at LACO, led by Tyler Cook, and the Division of Curriculum and Instructional Services, led by Raynette Sanchez and Yvonne Contreras. Thank you for your wonderful support and leadership enabling us to do this work. You are all welcome to continue to explore resources, ideas, and strategies for implementing the C3 framework for Social Studies state standards at the National Council for the Social Studies, socialstudies.org/C3. NCSS is the leading organization for social studies educators and is continuing to update its site with new professional development opportunities, conference offerings, bulletins, journals, and other valuable resources. And so, to close, we quote retired Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. Knowledge of our system of government and rights and responsibilities as citizens is not passed down through the gene pool. It must be taught. The College, Career, and Civic Life Framework will help each state improve civic learning for all students. Thank you.